Welcome to Exploring Nevada. I'm Gwen Clancy with the Nevada Department of Cultural Affairs. And in our series, we explore with you the cultural programs and historic places around the state that are really special. Today, we're in a magical place at Lake Tahoe, and here to tell us all about it is Ron James, the Historic Preservation Officer for our state.
We're here at the George Whitell Mansion on the north side of Lake Tahoe. It's one of the most beautiful settings in the entire nation. Tucked within this landscape, which George Whitell owned, is his complex of buildings that he had designed in 1936. And it's really a magnificent assemblage of these stone buildings that fold into the landscape and at the same time work with the landscape so that you see a degree of preservation of the natural environment as well as what's going on today with the buildings themselves. George Whitell worked very closely to design this complex, working with architect Frederick de Longchamps from Reno. De Longchamps was, of course, the fellow who proposed the designs, but Whitell was so fussy with them that it's almost a co-design, partly Whitell and partly de Longchamps. It is one of the most complex projects that de Longchamps undertook. We're, of course, on the Nevada side of the lake, the east side of the lake, which is so well preserved because George Whitell had a great deal of money during the Great Depression and was able to buy 27 miles of Nevada shoreline. He thought he might develop some of it, but for the most part, most of what he had was not developed. So the developed side of the lake is the California side, where all those houses and private inholdings exist. On the Nevada side, we see the consequence of George Whitell's ownership, because most of what he owned went into public management, and it now is a preserved, pristine state of what Lake Tahoe beauty is all about. You know, before we go down to the main house, it's important to point out the grounds and all the different buildings that are here. Whitell wanted a lot of outbuildings for servants and guests. Right up here, we have one of the many outbuildings that were built, and we see this wonderful stonework done by masons largely trained by the Stewart Indian School. So he used Native American masons as well as other masons, but the Native Americans really contributed a lot. You see also this black piece of metal that clings to the chimney here, featuring a chipmunk. Each one has a different forest motif. These were done by Italian iron workers who were working in the Bay Area and then brought their ironwork up here. This is one of the more peculiar buildings in this complex. This is called the Elephant House. Whitell probably did build it. It was one of the early structures, and he probably did build it for part of his menagerie. He's a very unusual person. Everything he did created folklore, and one of the things he did was to collect all sorts of animals. His favorite friend in the whole world was Bill the lion, but he also had several elephants, giraffes, cheetahs, and many other lions as well, all sorts of animals, zebras. The question was, how much did he bring them up here? Folklore maintains that he had 3 or 4 elephants up here at a time, with them trumpeting at the top of the elephant house. None of that's true. We do have clear evidence that he brought an elephant up here at least once. And the story is that the climate and the altitude didn't suit the elephant very well. But there's a bit of added folklore, and that is that when he flew the elephant up here, which he probably didn't, the seaplane crashed, sank, and the elephant drowned. That's almost certainly not the case, but it's a wonderful story, and so typical of the kind of magnet that Whitell represented for attracting these exotic stories. Ultimately, this was used largely for storage, but he did bring many of his animals up when he visited this facility every summer from 1940 until his death in 1969. When George Whitell died, a man named Jack Dreyfus purchased the estate. Jack Dreyfus is his own peculiar man. You might remember him as the Dreyfus Fund, the founder of the Dreyfus Fund, and his advertisement gimmick was to have a lion walking through the halls of Wall Street, very distinctive. I suppose this estate attracts unusual people, and George Whitell gave his estate over to Jack Dreyfus, and we have a perfect transition. Jack Dreyfus wanted to have this large addition attached to the Thunderbird Lodge of George Whitell, And he worked with preservationists. It isn't the best solution that you can imagine, but it isn't too bad, and it's historic in its own right. It was built over 20 years ago, and Jack Dreyfus is nationally significant, so we shouldn't discount it entirely. In addition, the architecture corresponds to the TRPA, which is the nation's first bi-state compact. It refuses to touch any ground. It rests gently on structures that George Whitell had created so that there's not an enlarged footprint. So it's an interesting piece of architecture and not to be discounted. It's also extremely useful. You can have conferences and weddings go on in there. It's a nice feature that helps keep this complex alive and accessible to the public. I want to take you back up this hill, and we're going to take a look at the lodge from another point of view, because there's a great set of stairs that the public doesn't always get to see, so it's worth taking a look at. So let's go on up here. This is one of the ways to get down to the lodge from the road at the top. It's my favorite, but it's closed off to the public usually because it's narrow and it's steep. All of the grounds here were done by the stonemasons after they completed the house and all the outbuildings. What's fascinating about this is that it's so eccentric and it meanders all over the place. It follows the path of the historic waterfall, but there definitely was an opportunity here for the stoneworkers to use their imagination and to build all sorts of eccentric things, structures that don't seem to have any purpose but are beautiful, a little dollhouse that resembles the lodge itself. It goes on and on. Now the lodge itself is an extremely steeply pitched roof. De Longchamps, the architect from Reno, originally designed a squat mountain cabin, but apparently Whitell didn't like that and wanted to refer back to structures that he had known during his many years living in Europe. Now I get to walk down these great steps. One of the reasons why I like it is because it's so steep. Whitell did not compromise the grounds to suit the design. He forced the design to suit the grounds, and that's why they don't let people use these steps, because they're too treacherous. But that's why I love it, because it's a perfect melding of this beautiful environment and the architecture and design that makes this place such a striking historic site. George Whitell normally only came here during the summer. Even his tunnel was only used during the summer, but it gave him a secret access to the lodge. And we walk over here, and we're in the midst of where the waterfall comes down. In a way, we're fortunate because it's off season and the waterfall isn't working. Now, why don't we go ahead and go into the lodge and down that tunnel we keep on telling you about. One of the things we should point out is right up here, this beautiful example of the Italian ironwork that's decorating the entire lodge. And of course, it's the Thunderbird. Whitell had a peculiar fixation with this motif from Native American folklore. He named his DC-2 the Thunderbird. He put Thunderbirds all over this lodge, so now it's called the Thunderbird Lodge. We're not sure if he actually called it that. And his boat was named the Thunderbird. It was a motif that recurs in his life, and this is one of the best of the iron Thunderbirds that are found throughout this complex. But let's go inside. The lodge is also beautiful and well worth taking a look at. Here we are inside the great room of the lodge, the old lodge of George Whitell's mansion. You're going to hear hammering because there's an ongoing restoration project. There's been a problem with water leaking through the back porch, and so they're going to rework it, and it's going to be a very complicated job. There's no place quite like this, so they have to invent techniques to match it. The interior here is very heavily with wood. It's dark. Whitell wanted the feel of a hunting lodge, and there's a brooding, somber quality to it. But this is rustic cottage revival, and it refers back to many of the European things that George Whitell encountered while living in Europe. At the same time, the huge rafters I can't help but believe that this is part of de Longchamp's fascination with mining. He was a mining engineer before he was an architect, and I think he wanted these big, heavy rafters and designed it in a way to refer back in its own way to Comstock mining and the square set timbers. The woodwork you see is all done by Norwegian craftsmen. And the chandelier, again, the Italian ironworkers, incorporates equipment from the logging industry up at Lake Tahoe. So they actually scavenged a part and then incorporated it into their ironwork and their design. So there's fanciful things going on, very imaginative, artistic, creative, and that is what George Whittell seemed to really enjoy about this process. This is the greatest thing he created in his life, a life that was slothful in many ways. He inherited money and didn't have to work, so he didn't work. But his creativity shone through here. He was not a foolish man. He was in fact very smart and obviously enjoyed artistry and architecture. You have a bedroom on both ends. On one end we see George with his favorite lion, Bill, who's there as a cub. Whittell's actually able to still hold him in his arms. And it's a beautiful, charming photograph of Whittell and Bill, and shows that kind of intimate relationship. And on the other end, his wife Ilya, who he married after finding her in France in 1919. He had been wounded and she was his nurse. And they married and were a devoted couple in their own way for their whole life. And she's posing there with one of their favorite cheetahs. George Whittell situated his lodge on one of the most dramatic points in the entire Lake Tahoe Basin. There isn't a bad view in this place, not even out of the bathrooms. Every window, every vantage point gives you a different perspective of the lake, and each of them is beautiful. This is one of the two bedrooms on the second floor of the lodge. And over here we see this, he was fascinated with gadgets. Whittell was, he was like Howard Hughes 20 years before his time. He flew, he loved technology, he loved film. They have a motion picture camera here at the lodge that belonged to George Whittell, and a wonderful projector as well. And these are all barometric instruments to help him understand the environment. He had to have every gadget he could possibly lay his hands on. We're down in the basement where the servants' quarters are, and here in the kitchen, right in here, you can see the degree of preservation. Original equipment, original refrigerator and stove, a really small, humble kitchen, but George Whittell was very finicky about his food, and he had to be fed the best. So this is where the cook worked, servants living in the other places, all at his demand and command, and believe me, he commanded them. We're right here in the laundry room. Down the hall you can see one of the servants' quarters, all very finely done. Not a bad place to be a servant. But the most important thing that's in here is the tunnel. You can see the sign, the tunnel. 600 feet of underground tunnel, as much as 3 stories beneath ground level, cut through solid granite by Cornish miners. It's a work of art and extremely interesting. After the Cornish miners blasted their tunnel through here, it was finished off by the stonemasons. So this is one of the nicer looking mines you're ever going to go into. We go down here past the furnace room and various rooms. This is the original boathouse, and it has a nice story attached to it. Whittell built it for one of his smaller boats, but when he built the Thunderbird, he needed a larger boathouse. We're going to go down there in a minute. When he built his larger boathouse, he wanted to convert this into a swimming pool, but one of the workers fell off his ladder and broke his neck. Whittell was so appalled by it, he stopped construction, and you can see all of the construction scaffolding here as it was the day that the fellow broke his neck. Whittell was appalled by it and wanted to just leave it be, never use this room again. Along here you can see a rail system. Whittell used this to cart supplies from the boathouse to the lodge. Usually he didn't allow any of his guests to come in here. This was only for his private access. But the one of his best friends that he did allow in here was Bill the Lion. It was nice and cool. It's very chilly in here. When you take a tour up here, make sure to bundle up. But Bill loved it during the summers when it was hot up on the surface. He could come in down here and cool. So this is where Bill ended up sleeping, according to stories. And we have nothing but all the rich stories about Whitell. Truth can be elusive, but stories are permanent. And there's no reason to believe that Bill didn't, in fact, like to come in here and sleep. The story that's told, however, is that when George Whitell did have guests here and they drank too much, he would lock them up in here with Bill the lion and then let them wake up with this lion. One can't tell whether that's true or not, but George was certainly capable of doing something like that. The tunnel exits right into this wonderful boathouse. As if the lodge and these extraordinary grounds weren't enough, we have this treasure that graces the boathouse on occasion, the Thunderbird, one of the most remarkable 20th century wooden boats in the world. You can hope that when you come up here on a tour it'll be here. It isn't always, but when you catch a glimpse of it here, or even better when it's coursing across the waves of Tahoe's beautiful lake, it's a sight to behold. There's nothing quite like it. It's sleek, its mahogany lines are unparalleled. It's really one of the nation's treasures in maritime history.
As luck would have it, we had a chance to ride on the Thunderbird earlier in the season and talk with the crew about the historic vessel.
You know, it's amazing to be on this lake with this boat. The lake is so beautiful. If you look at the majesty and the scenery and the beautiful mountains around us, and then to have the Thunderbird Lodge and to be a part of that, it's fantastic to have the boat and to make that a part of the history, but also to have the history of George Whitell and the beautiful, pristine scenery that he left us. I think all of it together creates a beautiful homogeny of and an experience that we can share today.
The boat's interior reflects George Whittell's appreciation for elegance. We asked the captain why this boat is sometimes referred to as the Lady of the Lake.
Well, I think that they refer to it as the Lady of the Lake as insofar as it being one of the more historic vessels on Lake Tahoe. Built for George Whitell, it was designed by John Hacker. It was built in 1939 in Bay City, Michigan, and was brought out here on a flat car and brought up from Truckee on the narrow gauge railroad to Tahoe City and launched there in July of 1940, and was George's personal boat for a number of years. In the early 60s, Bill Harrah bought the boat from Whitell and changed the configuration to what it is today from its original design.
The captain went on to explain how Bill Harrah put 2 aircraft engines in the boat. Why would Harrah do that, and what was the effect?
I think they used aircraft engines to gain less weight. They're lighter weight engine and more powerful. And I think Bill Harrah really liked going fast. So I think that was one of his motives for putting those in this boat.
Airplane engines should make quite a difference. Just how fast can she go?
Well, the way she's set up right now, we probably have a top speed of around 50 miles an hour. However, right now we're only cruising around 20. This is one of our slower speeds, and our normal cruising speed is around 30. Well, we generally draw a crowd from other boaters because it's such a unique looking vessel and has such a history to it. I think that's been one of the challenges of driving this thing around on the lake, is because so many other boaters want to get close, and so when you're approaching other boats, you notice that they're heading towards you, and there's really no place to go. You kind of just have to dodge other boaters and hope for the best.
As we headed down the shoreline, the wind was picking up. We asked the captain how he felt about having such a valuable boat out on rougher seas.
Yeah, I always get nervous when the wind starts blowing because it's so hard to handle around docks, and getting in and out of the boathouse is a big challenge when it's rough out. So in fact, I'm going to turn around right now just because we're down here by Glenbrook, and we see a little chop coming on the lake, and they're predicting high winds today. Well, the Thunderbird is 55 feet long and is 12 feet wide, a beam of 12 feet, and weighs around 30,000 pounds. The boathouse itself is 20 feet wide, so we've got 4 feet on either side of clearance. So it's a little bit tight, especially under any adverse conditions.
Back on land, we rejoin our tour with Ron James.
We're not going to go back to the lodge by way of the tunnel. It's pretty cold in there, and it's so beautiful out here. It's a good chance to see the rest of these grounds. It's worthwhile to point out that out there, right at the shoreline in the water, is a little lighthouse. It's so cute. It actually was a functioning beacon. Whitell put it out there so that when he went over to Cal Neva to see all the showgirls and to gamble, when he came back at night, he could have that lit and know where to navigate. This is a fascinating part of the architecture and the design of the landscape. It might escape somebody just walking along, but this is actually the undulating tail of a dragon. And at its end, we're going to see the dragon's head with all of its pointed teeth. This, by the way, is the card house. And you could see those beautiful flock of geese. It's another delicate ornamentation that the Italian ironworkers left on the face of that beautiful stonework. This is where George Whitell liked to bring a few of his older male guests to play cards, and he got very angry if they didn't have the $10,000 minimum. From here we get a nice perspective of the setting of the Whitell Mansion. Here on the south point of Sand Harbor, over there, we see the state park, the very steep mountains of the eastern slope of the basin. We overlook, at this point, George Whittell's private lagoon, and we see that beautiful emerald green color, that crystal clear Tahoe water that made this place famous from people who coming here from Mark Twain right to the present. And also from here, you get a perspective. The boathouse is there. We know that the tunnel goes underneath here. And from over at the gazebo, we get another nice view, because it's really from there that you can appreciate the subtle artistry that was built into the land bridge where I'm standing, right on the head of the dragon. So if you look over from this side of the lagoon, and it's pretty subtle, but it's there. The stonemasons were craftsmen, and they knew what they were doing. You could see teeth hanging down, and that bridge is the snout of the dragon, which is continued by that large piece of granite that juts out over the other piece of granite that it rests upon. And that's the dragon snout. Very subtle. It has to be pointed out to you. You could miss it, but it's nice to know it's there and that they were just folding that in there. You know, as we look up on that hillside over this beautiful setting, we get a feel for the pristine environment that George Whitell saved. It really wasn't his intent. He wanted to buy a big piece of real estate. He thought about developing it, but he loved nature and he loved not having to work very much, so he didn't develop, and very little of the Nevada side is developed as a result of this. But here's where you get to see the real legacy of George Whitell and what he left for later visitors to the Tahoe Basin. And this entire area is noted by environmental scientists for its pristine nature. So little has been developed here for well over a century that the water here is as clear as it can be. You know, we've only been able to show you just a little bit of this place. we want to let you know about places that are accessible, wonderful, charming little parts of the state, and this is certainly one of them, one of our great treasures. His lodge was originally very private, and no one was allowed here without permission, and he granted permission very rarely. We're very fortunate that it's now managed by the Thunderbird Preservation Society, and they make it accessible to visitors. You need to come up here to see the whole thing and to breathe this clear mountain air and to hear and these sounds and see this setting. Is nothing quite like it. We're so pleased that the Commission for Cultural Affairs has made grants available to this facility to keep it alive, to keep it available for the public. But you need to pull up your end of it by coming up here and be supportive and see it for yourself. I promise you, you won't be disappointed.
I'm sure you'll agree that this place is really special. Come check it out for yourself. And see you next time on Exploring Nevada.